Yeah, start.
Okay, fine. Okay, can I start now or
Yes, please.
okay? Morning everyone. Salam alaikum. So everybody, sorry, I just got I'm not fully prepared, but my apologies. I listen. So basically the guide. I'm going to share a guide with everyone on how to write a proposal, either for admission or for funding. And this guide is from the guide we use back in my institution and also for the funding organization in South Africa, which is the National Research Foundation. Basically, why do you write a proposal? The first thing is that you have to know why you write a proposal, why they want candidates to write the proposal. Basically, is to be able to check if the problem you are proposing is viable, is feasible, but sometimes you could propose a topic which is not feasible, and basically you can investigate it. And also the plan, your plan or research plan, is it acceptable? And also in terms of your rationale, is it effective also? So that's the purpose of a proposal. So one is for admission, maybe to give you admission. Two is also to give you funding. Sometimes you could get admission but not get funding for it. So the layout is basically the first is that is a title. The title should be concise, not too long, and you also try and avoid starting your title with present participle, like saying investigation. Rather, say an analysis of the investigation of something like that. So you could the main aim is the main message here is that your title must be concise so that it can pass the message. Because when it's very long, sometimes it's very difficult for you to pass the message. The second one is that you also try and beforehand in your proposal, you will try and clarify your basic terms. Like example, SMME, you need to each of the basic things you're going to use in your report, you can define them, your acronyms and things like that, so that the reader can see that beforehand. Sometimes maybe after you start using your abbreviations and things like that. Then, in terms of your background to your research problem, this needs to be very brief. Sometimes you might need to use a subheading because it needs to tie into your research problem, but the background should not be molded up with your research problem, because you want to be able to separate it. The background is very important because the background gives you, like what it says, the background gives you a little bit of what they call it, preparations or information on why the problem is. So this can be combined. This could be combined sometimes with some little bit of literature, but the subheadings are quite important. Also, the statement of the research problem, which is the art of your proposal, must sometimes of some candidates they try and model it up. They just list the objectives, the outcomes, and this. No, this needs to be uh, presented properly, and the key way we do it is basically, or we suggest that candidates or applicants do is to link it up with the objectives and the key questions. You try and break it such a way that you bring in like form of a funnel. You give the general problem example. Maybe we are looking about climate change. You could talk about some of the factors that contribute to climate change. Then you now zoom it out to the problem. So, okay, some people, some work has been done in maybe agriculture, the effect of climate change on agriculture, but specifically you're looking at maize or you're looking at wheat, you're looking at, not specific. So basically you're bringing a form of a funnel, you're narrowing it down. So the person sees that it's very clear. And obviously that is tied up with your objectives and your key questions. So the background basically is the top part, why the actual research problem, it's the narrow part which you put. In this case, if we're looking at how climate change relates to wheat farming, maybe in the northern parts of Nigeria or maybe in the southern part of Nigeria. So you must be specific, so that the person can see that properly. You can see that's the gap. Why giving the background, which is actually climate change. Now you now zoom it now to then in northern Nigeria or in Nigeria as a case study. So that is very, very key. After this state, in this part, you avoid jargons, you explain your concept clearly, as I said earlier, and you link it up with your objectives. Then the aims and the objectives of the research. You try and clarify your objectives, you make such a way that it's feasible. Most of the time, what I do to my students is that I advise that they present a general aim. Anyway, to use the example of what I just said earlier, you could say that your aim is to develop maybe a predictive model to look at the effect of climate change on wheat in northern Nigeria. That's the main aim. You now say, in order to achieve the above aim, this following specific objectives will be investigated. One, we're looking at gathering of data, from northern Nigeria, because northern Nigeria is quite big, you could say from 6 states. That's one objective. What kind of data? You could say maybe soil quality, another objective. You could look at, okay, in terms of what do you call it, fertilizers usage, another objective. So basically, the objectives, each of the objectives will be tied to the aim. The aim is the overall, what do you call it, overall achievement or overall purpose. But in order to achieve it, it's like we are breaking that aim now into smaller parts. That becomes your objectives. So that when you do that, the admission committee will be able to see that. At least you were able to break it down, and also the funders will be able to see that, and you give you a good chance. And the next one, it's your hypothesis, obviously, and your research questions. Most of the time, your research questions should be close to your objectives. Like with the example we gave earlier, if you say we're looking at what they call it, development of soil quality in 6 states or 3 states in Nigeria. So the question could be, the last question could be framed in the opposite and say, okay, climate change has affected the soil quality in 4 states out of more. The effect has been more in 4 states out of the 6 states. You now say, or it's affected all the states. So that's the question, because the question you want to ask is that you don't know the question. It could be either or it's affected 5 of the 6 states, or you could say one of the states is more effectively affected than the other 5 states. Those are the questions you want to ask. So that question ties into the objectives. So more often than not, I would normally advise our students that the number of key questions should be less than your objective, because you could use one question, you could tie one question to 2 objectives, and you don't want to have too many too many key questions. I normally advise my students to have 3 or 4 key questions. But the hypothesis, most of the time we advise that the student should have just one. So you could basically say, okay, a hypothesis is um, um, out of all the key questions, you could just take one and rephrase straight away that it's either or one or this. The example in this case now we could say the evidence where what they call it, you could say climate change has affected uh, five out of the six states, you know, or has not. So you just so what I'm trying to basically say is that the hypothesis should be just one hypothesis, while the key questions should be linked to the objective, but they should be less than the objectives. You could use one key question to investigate. You can tie one key question to two objectives, such a way, and the key questions should not be more than three or four. Then the obviously after you've read this thing, you have to see the sequence of the research. Why is it important? Why? What is the benefit? In that case, now you could say after this research, the second of this research is that the data you get will be able to assist in developing policy for agriculture, small-scale farmers in northern Nigeria or in Nigeria. It could assist in developing mitigating factors for climate change or for agricultural extension workers as input, all those things. Even for funders, you could say, could assist in um, developing financing models, things like that. So that we can see the overall benefit because your data, your research fit into some other key actionable plans for the funders, for government, for civil society, and for everybody. Then the last, oh, sorry, not the last, the eighth, obviously because it's a research, you can't do everything. You have to look at the boundaries of the research. Like we have said earlier, uh, non-Nigeria is quite big. You have to say, okay, in our case, we've said 6 states. That is the boundary. You're not going more than, in Northern Nigeria, we have, maybe we have 18 states or so, or you could say you're really taking 6 states, from the key areas, So you have to put a boundary. You can't do everything. You could say, okay, agriculture. Agriculture is quite wide. We're looking at, in our own case, we're looking at wheat, or we're looking at rice, or beans, something, because you can't do everything. If you can do, you can say, okay, rice and wheat. So these are 2 crops. So that boundary must be there because you need to, so that somebody sees your story and says, okay, you only worked on this area. So at least your results, that it's going to be confined to this 2 areas. So somebody else can now extend your research and say, okay, you've done on this, we are going to do on potatoes, on sugarcane, on something else, something like that. So, but you give a boundary of your research, or what some people call limitations also, but we call it the definition of research. The other thing is that we look at literature review, which I've said earlier. The literature review part of literature review can be depends on some templates. You can just build like a summary of literature review in your background, but you could make it as a separate one. Literature review is quite important. It should be, I normally advise that my students do what they call a critical literature review. Critical means that you try and such a way that you address such a way that you link it up with with the gaps and your objectives of your research. And you start by, like I said earlier, when we're looking about problem statement, talking about problem statement, you provide evidence of what has been done in the past and the current knowledge in the field. And you identify gaps and say, you could identify more than 1 or 2 gaps or 3 gaps, and you can say, okay, we want to address just one of the gaps. And this gap, in this case, we don't have data for the effect of climate change on wheat cropped in northern Nigeria. We could have for other crops, we don't have for this. So that is the gap. So literature will tell you that, okay, what is the effect of climate change all over the world? What is the climate change in Nigeria? Climate change, other activities. You now zoom it down. So, okay, what is the effect of climate change for wheat in Nigeria? Now, for northern Nigeria, for the 6 states. So you can see the way you are basically taking down, like it's like a funnel. And you don't duplicate. The reason why we also do literature reviews is that we don't, because you don't want to duplicate your risk, what other people have done. So it's essential that when you do your literature review, you need to state what have been done previously in the literature, and you also need to look at what you want to contribute. What is your own contribution? And you can only do that by identifying the gap, your understanding of the gap, and you're able to what they call it, express this understanding in the clear terms. So that's on the literature review. The key message is that literature review should correspond with the aims of the research. That's what a lot of evaluators look when they look at candidates' proposal. So if you just write, what a lot of students do, what we call it dumping. They just go to literature and just copy different things when there's no connection. You could people student a lot of like example student will just write. In this case, we're looking at just on climate change generally. But now you need to put that climate change, agriculture now to the type of agriculture. Agriculture is quite wide. It could be animal farming and things like that. But we are looking at wheat. So you look at food crops, wheat, then the region, Nigeria. So you can see you're bringing like key things. What we normally use is that, what do I advise my student to do is that I normally use what they call a mind map. So in this case, if we're looking at developing of a model of effect of climate change on wheat crop in northern Nigeria, the first one will be climate change as the main one. Then we'll look at agriculture as a subheading under it. We can look at northern Nigerian, can look at wheat. So that basically you can look at, you have three key subheadings under climate change. So that helps you to break down your literature review, and you obviously link it up to your aims of your research and your objectives. Then obviously, after you've done this gap analysis and you look at objectives and this, you have to tell us your research design, how you're going to go about addressing, investigating your the key questions to get data to answer your key questions and to also to achieve the objectives. Most of the time, if this section is not properly presented, you can even fail your proposal. You can the funders, obviously you will not be persuaded to fund it, and if it was to be what do you call it, your actual dissertation, you can also not pass through. So the different type of methods based from social sciences and engineering and science. You could use questionnaires, you could use personal interviews, focus group, laboratory experiments. In case of if you cannot do experiments, you can use model. Could be mathematical models, could be process models, systematic models. Softwares. You could write a code. Design techniques and things like that. So each one of them, you could even combine both. In some cases, like in my own research group, we combine experiment, we combine mathematical models, we combine sometimes if we're looking at policy, we combine some focal groups and things like that. So these techniques or this methodology must talk to each of the questions you want to answer. Maybe in our own case, we're looking at northern Nigeria, where we're using that case. We could go first, we could go and go to that environment or take a site we have taken. We could take soil samples, go to the lab, analyze them. We plant crops in this case. After some time, we look at the effects. We could take those healthy soils from a different area, take it to the lab, we culture, and we check, and we look at the difference. After we've looking that, we could take that model, take that data, write what they call a mathematical code to predict it, instead of us just saying that we can now say, okay, based on the data we have, we can write a mathematical model and say, if we were to, we've already done it for this area. If we were to do it for, based on the data, we can do it for other areas, the soil samples and everything. Then we could now take that information and say, okay, go do interviews on student and there's a focal group social and say, okay, this is what are your experiences and things like that. Or we could just, depends on this, we could just only do focal group based on your objectives on each one of them. So your methods must be able to answer, must be fit for purpose for each of the questions you want to ask. And you want to answer, sorry. Or you could combine methods even. Then after you have done that, okay, you have to also indicate, and that's one of the things, sometimes you have to indicate your sample size. Like in our case now, we could say, okay, because of cost, we want to do maybe 20 samples. If we're looking at population group, you could look at, you want to look at those people that we do focal group, you can look at, like we have said, 6 states, or we want to look at things like that. The experiment, obviously, we can look at controls, because you want to be able to compare something with it. So the sampling size is very, very important. You could say maybe we're looking at 12 samples, 50 samples, so that the reviewers and also the funders will be able to say, okay, these are your sample size. Basically, what you're trying to show is all your assumptions, all your limitations in terms of your sampling size, and the person can, so that they can be able to reproduce this, or they're able to understand this. Then that will assist you in your analysis, and also your statistical method you're going to use to analyze your data. And this point is quite very important. If it's poorly articulated, the chance of your proposal being successful is quite low. And the National Research Foundation, which we use as a guide in this, shows that this is one key area that often make student proposal not to fly through. Then obviously expected outcomes and the result and contribution to knowledge. Like I said earlier, you need to state such a way that how your results, the contributions fit into the larger society. Is it going to be a new theory? Is it going to be a new prototype, a new model, a new artifact, or in our case, a new chemical plant, a process plant, a solution to a practical problem, a new instrument that we use in measuring what they call measuring data, or evaluating data, or collecting samples, a specific aid to practitioner in the particular field, So in our case, it could be a key input for, policy making in Northern Europe, or for funding or to evaluate the state of funding or preparedness for the effect of climate change in Northern Nigeria, or food chain, all those things like that. So you need to basically show that, how your results, all your contributions will fit in. You could say, in our case, could be how to improve the value chain, in terms of production, food security. It could be assistant of food, it could assist in food security in Northern Nigeria. Then summary, obviously. Summary, after you have said this, you need to give a summary. Most of the time, we encourage the summary must be concise. In this case, we advise about 250 words maximum of what you have summarized. It should not be new material that you have not referred to in the body of the proposal. And lastly, keywords. The keywords should be specific keywords or phrases used and it should not be more than 5. And your references, obviously. Your references must be listed in your proposal. You need to follow the different referencing style, Harvard, Vancouver, anyone that the requirement, each template or each institution has its own. But if you're given a leeway, you can look at the one that suits you. These days, there are a lot of what they call it, a lot of software you can use to assist you in listing your references, endnotes, and other things like that. Or you could do it manually if you feel you don't have access or you're not comfortable with it. I've shared after we have look at these are basically the guidelines. Then in terms of how we evaluate proposal, I've shared it with Dr. Abdugani. Most of the time, after we've written the proposal, like is the government agency funding research or the committee. When you look at the problem statement, these are the questions they ask. I've shared this with this, maybe this can guide you in writing your proposal in the next few days. Is the problem line of question clearly defined? Obviously, that is one of the first things. If it's not clearly defined, you need to be able to break it down to a non-technical person in that field, because sometimes, especially if you're sending it for funding in the committee, most of the guys or the earlier people that screen, it could be administrative staff, or sometimes these days they use um what they call it, AI tools to screen keywords. So you need to be able to it must be clearly defined. One is the well-formulated research problem. Like I said earlier, it must be linked. Your problem must be linked to your objectives. Is it concise? Is it brief? And you should also try to avoid obscure jargons that you use. And the background to the research problem, uh, is it well described? Like I said earlier, you give a background such a way that like if you present such a way like the way you present your literature with like a funnel. You look at, in this case, the general problem of climate change. Now on agriculture, on wheat, then lastly on northern Nigeria. And you could even go further to say the 6 states. So that person sees that that's the what they call it, the background to the problem. The literature review is a clear evidence of thorough literature review. It must be thorough, it must be comprehensive. You want to produce a comprehensive literature review in that problem. The first is that you want to be able to show, in our case, if we were to look at climate change in northern Nigeria and agriculture and wheat, you must give us the literature, firstly on climate change, must be concise, not just broad and interconnected. Climate change, look at climate change for agriculture, wheat, northern Nigeria. So it must be clear. Then you must provide what they call it, engagement with relevant literature. Like in this case, you don't go and present climate change on maybe on other things, on other aspects of life, on maybe transportation. Here is on agriculture. You don't dwell in out of that field, because agriculture is your main domain. You don't provide climate change on transportation infrastructure or something like that. You want to look at agriculture. And if you want to divert on transportation, you must relate it back to agriculture. You could say, okay, also has effects on maybe bridges and roads, and that can affect in what they call it, how the farmers able to access their feeds, all those things, but they must be connected, So because your aim is more on the agriculture part of it. If you want to talk about other things, you must connect it back to agriculture. So there must be some interconnection between all the key things you described. It must not just be dumped there. You must try and all the things you see, you must connect it to your key areas of, in this case, climate change, agriculture with northern Nigeria. So if somebody is provide in this place providing what they call it, climate change and agriculture more on maybe in maybe Iceland, in Europe, where the conditions are different from northern Nigeria, it will not be useful. The person needs to relate it to Nigeria, to an area that has the same climatic conditions with Nigeria, or even Nigeria, which is your case study. If there is not a lot of work done, little you can say that, but you cannot use closer ones. Okay, maybe there's a lot of work done in Niger, in Chad, in literature. You can now relate and say, okay, this could be similar expectations. So that person can see that, you know. But if you provide literature on something that is a little bit far from it, the examine or the funders will say you have not really applied your mind to that, because you should be able to provide complementary, interconnected concept based on for your own case study. Then the commercial framework. This is for those who more in what they call it, that do more a lot of work on social science and things like that. So your commercial framework basically the theory you're going to use, and you link it up with your hypothesis and research questions. You could develop, like in this case, you could develop commercial framework that relates to agriculture, climate change, and policy. What kind of policy tool you can use, and different hypotheses you could pose, and key questions. Obviously, your objectives. When you look at objectives, these are the things they look at. Are they clearly stated? The clarity and coincideness seems to be key things that um, examiners or funders look at. And like I said earlier, your objectives should not be too many, because they also look at the duration of the study. If you're doing a master's, 2 years, a PhD, 3 years, sometimes 4 years maximum. So you want to look at, if you put too much objectives there, it might not be achievable for you. So in this case, 3 or 4 objectives, could be advisable. You could take one objective and even try and maybe divide it in terms of activities, because now each of the objectives could have different activities. And in terms of the methodology, which is also one key area, apart from the problem statement and objectives, we look at, is it well designed, is it well structured, the outline, and the activities, each of the activities that you want to do are they clearly articulated? Is there a clear correspondence between the aims and research design? So, like I said earlier, if I say I want to look at the soil quality of this thing, what kind of test am I going to do? Is it turbidity test, all the fertility tests, or my ions and things like that, all the chemicals, or what do you call it? I will not be, if I say I want to do soil test, I will not be, I will not, if I now introduce other things like maybe, what do you call it? Something that is not to do with soil. Maybe I'm looking at, can't think it off my front of my head now. Maybe water test example, so if I were to say water test, I could say, okay, maybe I have to link it up with the soil, because that's the key thing. How does the water affect the soil there? So I'm saying that it has to be related to your objective, your experiment related to your objective. I should not be doing activities or tests that will not relate to objective. And also, most of the time, we have to say, why are we doing the test? I'm doing the test because I want to what they call it, test the soil quality. I want to look at the ions and everything, and the equipment I'm going to use for the test. The equipment, if I go and use an equipment, maybe I look at a chromatograph to look at the elemental composition. Why did I choose that equipment? Is it feasible? what are the limits of the equipment? I will measure, like I said earlier, I want to measure maybe between 200 to 500 um, um, what do you call it, millimeters per liter or something like that. Will that equipment be able to measure that? My limitation of that equipment, you know, and the theory behind my analysis. So that's all those things must be clearly stated. You know, once the examiners of the see that no, this student has the knowledge. So, but when I must emphasize that sometimes at the initial stage of writing the proposal, um, you might not fully understand it because you are new in the field, but you must endeavor to be able to um, improve on that. You could say some techniques that maybe you don't know how to use equipment. You don't have to say that. You can learn that. You can just say, but the principle of the equipment, you should be able to know at that time. How does the equipment work? You might not be able to know how to use the equipment because you might need to be trained on the equipment. At that time, you don't need to say that in your proposal. Just say the equipment will be used to do X, Y, and the principle of the equipment works like this. So the examiner knows that you understand the principle, but the actual practical experience you will be trained later. You don't need to say that in your proposal. But you need to show that you understand how that principle of the equipment works, you know. Then in terms of your significant, what we'll look at is that what extent will you make original contribution? At a doctoral level, we want to make original contribution, the questions you're going to answer, how are you going to answer them? Will you really, has it been answered before in a different way? So those are the things we'll look at. Why is it important to take the research? People say, no, this research is not because your methodology, or your questions are fine, but your approach to answer it is wrong. So that could affect. So your questions could be right, spot on. Nobody answered the question, but the way you want to answer your methodology can be wrong. So all those things look at the significant. Will you be able to produce the right result? You know, so those are things we look at. Your experimental design. Sorry, experimental design and also your objectives and how you're going to go about. Is it critically spelled out? Are you arrive at conclusions, make proposals? So those are the things that we want to look at when we evaluate. Then obviously feasibility. Is the problem researchable? Is it fixable? Uh, uh, the candidate profile. If you say you want to, maybe you want to do a PhD in a field, and they say the student needs these skill sets, should be able to program in Python, should be able to analyze equipment using an equipment, or maybe already understand principles of chromatography, things like that. So they will look at that. So you could also say that okay, this key set will be used. I have this, this. Does the supervisors have also that's this for funding now? Not only what they could not only the student, maybe you are submitting a proposal for funding this would the supervisor be able to support? Would the supervisors do they have expertise in that field? The supervisors do they have enough equipment? Will they have enough equipment to support the student? You don't want the student to come in and 2, 3 years the student is looking for access to equipment. So those are the things that some of the funders also look at. But this one obviously is not in your domain, but those are the things that you could, basically look at when you're also writing for external funding. Then general comments, obviously, is the proposal well structured? If it's not well structured, then in terms of your proofreading and editing, language, editing, take your time. These days we're lucky we have a lot of AI tools we can use to proofread. You could use so many of them, even your Gmail, Google, you can use it to proofread and things like that. So those are the things, the checklist we use in looking at proposal after we have given these guidelines. I think for now I can stop. If there are any questions or clarifications, we're advised or welcome to to seek for questions or clarifications.
Thanks, Professor Oborien. Thanks for that very, very insightful and helpful presentation. It's more of a guidance. It's really appreciated. I'm very sure the participants will have some few questions to ask. So you can unmute yourself if you want to ask questions, and if you want to set it in as a chat, I'm more than happy to pick it up for you. And then while Prof is still with us here, he will respond to our questions, at least in the next 15 minutes or thereabout. Uh, do you have any specific questions, maybe regarding to a proposal you're writing or a plan, or you need clarifications, maybe about the research design, or maybe the research questions, or how do you identify knowledge gap in journal articles if you're reading them, and things like that? If you have any question that's been brought, yes, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof, for the amazing knowledge that you've shared with us. I'm very, very grateful. So I would like to ask the background of the study and the literature review, what sets them apart? And in the background of the study, is there a need to, should it be in one's own words, or should it be backed by what papers have also mentioned? Like what sets it apart from the literature review? And is there a need to actually make citations and things like that? I think that would be my first question.
Okay, no, thanks. The background is more of a summary. So it's not as detailed as the literature review. And if you have citations, I think there's no problem. But the thing is that if you in the background, if you say a word that is of a fact, sometimes it's also very good for you to back it up with references. Like example now, if the example we're using in terms of what they call it, climate change on agriculture, wheat farming in northern Nigeria. You could start by saying in the background and say the effect of climate change all over the world is known. You could give a reference, on literature from this. Everybody knows that, but if you give a reference, it further buttresses it. Then you go ahead and say on is in agriculture different. You could say that. Then you now go and say with Northern Nigeria. So basically, for me, the background is it's more a summary. It's not a detailed literature, but a summary of the issues you want to discuss. It's not as detailed as the literature. The literature review now, so in the literature review now introduce and say, okay, effect of climate change on wheat in maybe in what do you call it, in Russia, in Ukraine, things like that. You now give studies X and Y, X, Y, Z, and I've talked about this. This is where the findings they got. This is where the variables they measured. This is like that. In sort of the person sees that in the literature review. So the literature review is more detailed than the background of the body. It fits into the background. I don't know if that explains or answers your questions.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, sir. So, can I ask other questions?
You can go ahead, yes.
Okay, so I have found that two-page research proposals are very common these days. So for a two-page research proposal, what do you suggest the structure should be? And also, sir, the literature review, how would it come in? Because a two-page writing the introduction, the background, the research objectives, the significance, and expected outcomes and things like that. I think that all those already capture a two-page. And so I always ask myself, where does the literature review come in? So what should be the structure, and is a literature review required at all? And then aside that, where would the references also come in? I just want to get a proper picture. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. In a two-page review, literature review and background, I think in that case we come as one. You don't have to separate them because you now have a challenge of space. So what a lot of people do in the two-page proposal is because they don't want to, maybe they have a lot of, they have a lot of applicants, they don't want to read take their time to read a lot. So basically, they're trying to test your ability to compress your message in a short space. So in that case, I would advise that your literature review, your background, is just in one section. The key things that you need to in that area is that your background and your literature review should be just one paragraph. Your objectives and your aims, also one paragraph. Methodology, because you want to a little bit, this thing could be maybe one or two paragraphs. Your problem statement should be one paragraph. Then the next maybe half a page or so will be your references. And you obviously in this case, because you are pressed for space, you only only provide the key references. You don't want to overpopulate your something. So you need to remove a lot of the references that are not directly related to your work. So you cite the references that are very key. The seminar work in that your feed. Those are the ones that you cite. So that gives you that opportunity to be able to make that two-page. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes, sir, it does. Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
So do you have any other question? Thanks, Prof, for that elaborate feedback. Do you have additional questions that we want to ask before we go on break?
Okay, let me just talk on, I think Dr. Abdigeni said something about how to read, when you read journals and you look at gaps. More often, what I advise my students is that if you are new in a field, if you can try and get a review paper as a start, a seminar review paper in your feed, that assists you because you are new. That review paper, if it's a very good review paper, condenses all the facts in one. So in that review paper, there will be references on key areas. Then that review paper will guide you to source relevant papers in those feed. Then that can assist you to now able to rephrase or frame your gap. Most of the time, most of those review papers were already giving you a gap, but those gaps might not be, I'll use the word, might not be understandable to you at that level, because they could be talking at a higher level that you don't really, you don't understand. So what you want to be able to show, you want to be able to understand your own gap in such a way that you can explain it to maybe a grade 6, a grade 7 student, So I advise that you start by reading a comprehensive review in your feed. So in this case, we're using an example of climate change. You could look at climate change, effect of climate change on agriculture, because you might not get the one on wheat because it might be too specific. Just generally on agriculture all over the world. Or if you're lucky to get the one on wheat, it's fine. So once you get that, that gives you they will identify the gaps, based on each country, who that go with, we give you, they will look at, and they look at the science, and they look at the science, the gaps, technology gaps, and things like that, deployment policies, things like that. Then you can take some of those gaps and say, okay, how does it apply to your own case study? So that's one way of identifying gaps from journals. So it makes it easier for sort of you reading so many journals that you are near in the feed. So the review paper is very comprehensive in the highest in a reputable journal. That can guide you to start identifying gaps. And also, if you already started your program or your studies, your supervisor can also guide you in doing that too.
Thanks, Prof, for that. Yes, thank you very much. So do we have additional questions we want to ask before we go on break? So in the absence of no further questions, I want to assume that what would happen is when we get into the writing process itself, maybe questions will start popping up. So thanks a lot, Professor Oborien, joining us from Johannesburg this morning in South Africa. And then for all the participants, we'll go on a short break and then we'll come back at, because we've had a very lengthy session, let's come back at, I think we should come back at 12:15, so that we'll have the session before we go for the lunch break. So when we come back at 12:15, we're going to go through writing the proposal and we'll start the whole hands-on process in earnest. Thank you, everyone, and then we'll see you at 12:15.